February 15th, 1944. Cheyenne, Wyoming. The wind off the high plains cut through the massive hangar like a knife, carrying with it the smell of aviation fuel, hot metal, and something else. Desperation. Inside, beneath banks of industrial lights that turned night into day, a Boeing B-17G sat with its tail section opened like a patient on an operating table. The aircraft, serial number 42-97261, had rolled off Boeing's Seattle production line just 18 days earlier, perfect and gleaming and completely inadequate for the war it was about to enter. Standing beneath that tail section, staring up at the cramped compartment where young men would soon fight for their lives, was a civilian engineer named W. Erickson. He held a set of blueprints in hands stained with grease and graphite, but he wasn't looking at the plans. He was looking at a death trap, the so-called Stinger tailgun position, with its tiny windows, primitive ring and bead sights, and guns that could barely elevate or traverse, represented everything wrong with how the U.S. Army Air Forces had approached defensive armament. And Erickson, a 51-year-old maintenance supervisor for United Airlines who had never fired a shot in anger, was about to change aerial warfare forever with a modification the military hadn't asked for, didn't want, and would eventually adopt across every B-17 flying fortress produced for the rest of the war. This wasn't supposed to be his job. He was supposed to install radios, check fuel systems, make sure the Norden bomb sights were properly calibrated. But 3 weeks earlier, Erickson had done something that most engineers never do. He had read the casualty reports from the 8th Air Force in England, not the sanitized summaries that went to newspapers, the actual after-action reports filled with clinical descriptions of how men died at altitude over Germany. And one position appeared again and again in those reports: tailgunner, killed in action, position compromised, unable to defend against fighter attack from 6 o'clock high. The cold arithmetic was undeniable. In late 1943, as the 8th Air Force's daylight bombing campaign reached its terrible crescendo, tailgunners were dying at rates that made even hardened combat veterans sick with dread. The United Airlines Modification Center in Cheyenne wasn't supposed to exist the way it did. When the Army Air Force's Materiel Command had contracted with United Airlines in January of 1942, the agreement was simple: finish the B-17s that Boeing, Douglas, and Vega were producing as fast as possible. Install the final equipment, test the systems, and get them overseas. Production line work, assembly line efficiency, nothing creative, nothing that questioned the decisions made by men with stars on their shoulders and degrees from West Point. But United Airlines had something those men didn't have: experience. The Cheyenne facility had been United's primary maintenance hub since the 1930s, back when Boeing had owned United Airlines before Congress forced them to separate in 1934. The 500 mechanics, engineers, and technicians who worked in those massive hangars along Warren Avenue knew more about keeping aircraft flying in brutal conditions than most military officers would learn in a career. They understood that every aircraft design was a compromise, and that some compromises killed people. By February of 1944, the Cheyenne facility had already modified more than 2,000 B-17s. Most of the changes were minor, adding the latest radio equipment, installing updated navigation systems, fitting the Lorenz blind landing apparatus that might save a crew limping home through English fog. But the engineers at Cheyenne had been watching the war, reading the reports, talking to the ferry pilots who brought the bombers from the factories, and they had been keeping a list of problems that nobody in authority wanted to admit existed. The tailgun position was at the top of that list. The original B-17E tailgun mount, introduced in 1941, had seemed adequate when the Flying Fortress was being designed. Two 50-caliber machine guns mounted on a simple yoke, operated manually by a gunner who knelt or sat in the cramped tail compartment. Small plexiglass windows provided visibility. A ring and bead sight, the same type of sight soldiers had been using since the First World War, helped the gunner aim. The entire installation weighed relatively little and didn't complicate the aircraft's design. On paper, it worked. In combat, it was a disaster. The windows were too small. The gunner couldn't see attacking fighters until they were dangerously close. The ring and bead sight required the gunner to manually calculate lead and range while being thrown around by evasive maneuvers and turbulence. At 25,000 feet, the guns could only elevate about 35 degrees and traverse perhaps 60 degrees total. A Messerschmitt Bf-109 pilot who knew his business could approach from angles where the tail gunner literally could not bring his guns to bear. And the entire position was unarmored, surrounded by nothing but thin aluminum skin and hope. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Staff Sergeant James Hannigan, tail gunner aboard a B-17F named Lucky Strike, had survived 11 missions over Germany by November of 1943. In his letters home to his wife in Pittsburgh, carefully censored to remove any specific details, he described the tail position with grim honesty. "You can't see them coming until they're close enough to kill you," he wrote on November 23, 1943, 4 days before his aircraft went down over Bremen. "The sight doesn't work right when we're taking evasive action. The guns won't point where I need them to point. I'm back here alone, and all I can do is shoot at what I can see and pray that's enough." Lucky Strike went down with all hands on its 12th mission. The after-action report from the formation noted that enemy fighters had attacked from 6 o'clock high. The tailgun position showed no signs of effective return fire, and the aircraft fell out of formation, trailing smoke from the rear fuselage. James Hannigan died doing a job for which he had been given inadequate tools. This was the reality that W. Erickson understood when he looked at that tail compartment in February of 1944. The B-17 was called the Flying Fortress. It bristled with 13 50 caliber machine guns in the G model. Crews took pride in their defensive firepower, but that firepower only mattered if the gunners could actually aim and fire effectively, and in the tail position, they simply couldn't, not with the equipment they had been given. The Luftwaffe had figured this out within months of facing B-17s in combat. Intelligence reports from debriefed Luftwaffe prisoners confirmed what 8th Air Force crews already knew from bitter experience. German fighter pilots were trained to attack from the rear quarter, diving from above or climbing from below, exploiting the limited firing angles of the Stinger tail mount. The tactic was so effective that by late 1943, tail gunners had developed a grim gallows humor about their position. "They call it the Stinger," one gunner told a Stars and Stripes reporter in December of 1943. "But we call it the coffin. You're back there alone. And when the fighters come, you better get lucky or say your prayers." The statistics supported their fear. Analysis of 8th Air Force combat losses from July through December of 1943, compiled by Army Air Force's intelligence, showed a disturbing pattern. When B-17s were shot down by fighter attack, damage to the tail section was present in 68% of cases. Tail gunners killed or severely wounded before the aircraft was lost. 53%. Compared to other positions, tail gunners suffered disproportionate casualties. They weren't just dying, they were dying without being able to adequately defend themselves or their aircraft. W. Erickson had been an engineer for United Airlines since 1932. He had maintained DC-3s, flying mail routes over the Rocky Mountains in winter storms. He had dealt with ice, mechanical failure, and the unforgiving mathematics of aviation, where small problems became catastrophic at altitude. He understood systems, and he understood that the B-17 tailgun position was a system that was failing. The question was whether anyone would let him fix it. The Army Air Forces had spent millions of dollars developing the B-17's defensive armament. Teams of engineers at Wright Field in Ohio had designed the gun mounts, tested the sights, approved the installation. Who was W. Erickson, a civilian maintenance supervisor in Wyoming, to second-guess them? But Erickson had something those engineers at Wright Field didn't have. He had freedom. The United Airlines Modification Center operated under a fairly loose contract. They were supposed to make the aircraft combat-ready, and the contract gave them substantial latitude in how they did that, as long as the modifications didn't interfere with primary systems or add excessive weight. United's engineers could make changes they deemed necessary. This flexibility existed because the Army Air Forces needed aircraft delivered quickly, and United had a reputation for efficiency. The military would rather have aircraft with minor unauthorized improvements than aircraft sitting in hangars waiting for approval of every modification request. Ericsson had used this latitude before. He had designed the monocoque cheek gun installations that gave B-17Gs better frontal defense. He had improved the radio operator's gun position. His modifications were showing up in combat and saving lives. Now, he wanted to tackle the hardest problem: the tail. But on February 8, 1944, Ericsson submitted a proposal to his supervisor, James Henderson, the operations manager at the Cheyenne facility. The proposal was radical. Ericsson wanted to completely redesign the tailgun position. Larger windows, made from heavy plexiglass, giving the gunner 180 degrees of visibility instead of the current tunnel vision slots. A powered mounting system, replacing the manual yoke, allowing the gunner to track fast-moving fighters with hydraulic assistance. Most radically, a completely new sight system, not the primitive ring and bead that required manual calculation, but a reflector sight with an illuminated reticle that would automatically account for bullet drop and help the gunner calculate lead. The new mount would give the guns nearly 90 degrees of elevation and 120 degrees of traverse. A fighter approaching from almost any rear angle would be in the gunner's field of fire. The proposal included detailed drawings, weight calculations, and a brutally honest assessment of the current system's failures. Ericsson had compiled casualty statistics. He had interviewed ferry pilots who had talked to combat crews. He had even contacted the 8th Air Force's Technical Liaison Office, requesting information about tailgun effectiveness in combat. The data all pointed to the same conclusion. The Stinger tail was killing the men who used it. Henderson read the proposal. Then he read it again. Then he called Ericsson into his office and closed the door. "Do you understand what you're asking?" Henderson said. He was a careful man, conscious that United Airlines was operating under a military contract during wartime. Unauthorized modifications could mean trouble. "You want to tear apart the tail section of a brand new aircraft and install systems that don't exist yet. The Army hasn't approved this. Wright Field hasn't designed it. You're talking about making changes to an aircraft that's already in production." "I'm talking about saving lives," Ericsson replied. He put the casualty statistics on Henderson's desk. Numbers, cold and undeniable. Tailgunners are dying because they can't see the enemy until it's too late and can't aim effectively even when they do see them. The current mount is inadequate. It's been inadequate since 1941. We know how to fix it. The question is whether we have the courage to actually do it. Henderson looked at the numbers. He had flown mail routes himself in the 1930s. He understood the difference between adequate engineering and good engineering. He also understood something else. If this modification worked, United Airlines would be making unauthorized changes to military aircraft. If it failed, or if it caused problems, the company could lose its contract. But if they did nothing, men would keep dying for lack of a better gun mount. "How long to build a prototype?" Henderson asked. 2 weeks, Ericsson said, "if you approve overtime and let me pull the best fabricators from the production line." "You have 1 week, Henderson said, "and if this doesn't work, it's my head along with yours." Ericsson didn't waste time celebrating. He pulled a team of 6 fabricators and metal workers off their regular assignments. He requisitioned a B-17G that had just arrived for standard modifications, serial number 42-97261. And he went to work. The fabrication shop at Cheyenne ran 24 hours a day. Ericsson's team worked in 12-hour shifts, cutting aluminum, welding support structures, adapting hydraulic systems originally designed for other purposes. The mount itself came from studying the B-24 Liberator's tail turret, which used a powered system. But the B-24's turret was too large and heavy for the B-17's smaller tail section. Ericsson had to design something new, lighter, that could fit in the available space without requiring major structural changes. The windows were custom fabricated at a plexiglass supplier in Denver, massive curved panels that would give the gunner a panoramic view. The reflector sight came from aircraft instrument manufacturers in California, modified to work with .50 caliber trajectories. The hydraulic system was adapted from bomber turret components already in the supply chain, meaning it could be maintained by regular armorers without special training. Every piece had to be designed to be manufacturable at scale. Ericsson knew that if this worked, it would need to be installed on thousands of aircraft. It couldn't be a custom solution. It had to be producible. By February 15th, the prototype was ready. The new tail section looked completely different from the standard Stinger mount. The windows were enormous, giving the gunner visibility that approached what pilots had from the cockpit. The gun mount was enclosed in what crews would start calling the pumpkin, a bulbous fairing that housed the hydraulic system and gave the mount its distinctive shape. The guns themselves could now elevate to track high-diving fighters and traverse wide enough to cover nearly the entire rear arc of the aircraft. Test pilot Captain Ralph S. Johnson climbed into 2-97-261 on a cold February morning, and Army Air Force's technical liaison officer, Major Edmund Whiting, came along to observe. Nobody had officially approved this modification, but nobody had specifically forbidden it either. And in the chaos of wartime production, that ambiguity was enough. Staff Sergeant Thomas Brennan, a gunner instructor temporarily assigned to Cheyenne, occupied the tail position. The aircraft climbed to 20,000 feet over the Wyoming prairie. Johnson put the B-17 through a series of evasive maneuvers simulating combat conditions. Brennan, sitting in the new position, tracked imaginary fighters with the new mount. After 45 minutes, they landed. Brennan emerged from the tail compartment with an expression that the ground crew would remember for years. "This is what we should have had from the beginning," he said. His voice was quiet, but there was anger underneath. "Boys are dying with the old mount. With this, they'd have a fighting chance." Major Whiting watched the demonstration, made notes, and said very little. Then he requested to see the casualty statistics that had prompted the modification. Ericsson gave him everything: numbers, after-action reports, letters from tail gunners describing the inadequacy of the Stinger position. Whiting read it all. 3 days later, he sent a message to Wright Field and to 8th Air Force Headquarters in England. The message was carefully worded, professional, and devastating. It confirmed that United Airlines in Cheyenne had developed an unauthorized but potentially significant improvement to B-17 defensive armament, and it recommended immediate evaluation for field adoption. The message included Brennan's assessment and Ericsson's casualty analysis. It did not pull punches. The current tailgun mount was contributing to unnecessary losses of aircraft and crew. What happened next would normally take months. The Army Air Force's bureaucracy was legendary. Design changes required approvals from multiple offices, testing programs, production planning. But in February of 1944, the 8th Air Force was bleeding. Losses over Germany were unsustainable. Crews were being asked to fly mission after mission, knowing that statistically they wouldn't survive 25 missions. The casualty rates were breaking even the bravest men. The Army Air Forces needed solutions, and it needed them immediately. Within 72 hours of Whiting's message, a team of engineers from Wright Field was on a train to Cheyenne. They brought with them authorization to observe, evaluate, and, if appropriate, fast-track the Cheyenne tail modification for immediate adoption. The engineers spent 3 days at Cheyenne. They flew in the modified aircraft. They reviewed Ericsson's documentation. They interviewed the fabricators who had built the prototype. They calculated weight and balance changes. They assessed maintenance requirements. And on February 22nd, they sent their recommendation to Washington. The new tail mount, officially designated the Cheyenne tail after its place of origin, should be immediately incorporated into all B-17G production and retrofitted to existing aircraft as they pass through modification centers. The improvement in gunner visibility, firing arc, and target acquisition was so substantial that it constituted a force multiplier for defensive firepower. The cost and production time were minimal. The weight increase was acceptable. There was no tactical or engineering reason not to implement it immediately. That recommendation arrived on the desk of General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, on February 25th. Arnold had been fighting the daylight bombing campaign's casualty rates for months. He had been receiving reports about inadequate defensive armament, about crews losing faith in their equipment, about tail gunners who felt abandoned by their own side's engineering decisions. The Cheyenne tail modification offered a solution that didn't require years of development or millions in new spending. It just required admitting that a civilian engineer in Wyoming had seen a problem that the military's own experts had missed or ignored. Arnold approved the modification on February 27th, 1944. 12 days after W. Erickson had installed the first prototype. United Airlines in Cheyenne was authorized to begin immediately installing the new tail sections on all B-17Gs passing through their facility. Boeing, Douglas, and Vega were directed to incorporate the design into their production lines as quickly as possible. Field modification centers in England received technical packages and authorization to retrofit existing aircraft with the new tail sections as time and resources permitted. Boeing incorporated the Cheyenne tail into their production line with the B-17G-80-BO production block in June of 1944. Douglas followed with their B-17G-50-DL block the same month. Vega added it to their B-17G-55-VE block in July. By autumn of 1944, every new B-17 Flying Fortress rolling off the production lines came equipped with the Cheyenne tail as standard equipment. But the real story wasn't in the factories. It was over Germany. Lieutenant Richard Manning was a tail gunner with the 91st Bomb Group, stationed at RAF Bassingbourn in England. He had flown 15 missions with the old Stinger tail mount. In March of 1944, his aircraft, a B-17G named 909, went to the Field Modification Center at Burtonwood for the Cheyenne tail upgrade. Manning was skeptical. He had survived 15 missions by instinct, experience, and more luck than he wanted to admit. He didn't trust changes. Changes meant unknowns. But on his 16th mission, April 5, 1944, a target in Magdeburg, Germany, Manning discovered what the new tail could do. The formation was 40 miles inside Germany when FW-190 fighters attacked from 6 o'clock high, the classic rear quarter approach that every tail gunner dreaded. Manning saw them coming 3 seconds earlier than he would have, with the old, small windows. 3 seconds at combat speeds. That was enough time to get set, to get the guns on target. The new hydraulic mount tracked smoothly as Manning followed the lead fighter. The reflector sight put a bright aiming point exactly where it needed to be. Manning pressed the triggers. He saw his tracers walking up toward the Focke-Wulf. He saw impacts sparking along the fighter's wing route. The fighter peeled away, trailing white smoke, then black smoke, then tumbling toward the earth thousands of feet below. Manning's intercom crackled with voices from the rest of the crew confirming the kill. But Manning wasn't listening. He was tracking the second fighter, the wingman who hadn't expected the tail gunner to be so effective. More tracers, more impacts. The second fighter broke off without firing, unwilling to press an attack into that kind of defensive fire. 909 returned to Bassingbourn without a scratch. Manning's after-action report was terse but clear. The new tail mount is vastly superior to the old system. Visibility excellent. Gun elevation and traverse give complete rear coverage. Reflector sight allows fast target acquisition. Recommend immediate installation in all aircraft. He wasn't the only one. Across the 8th Air Force, as more B-17s received the Cheyenne tail modification, tail gunners reported similar experiences. The position was still dangerous. Men still died, but they died less often. And when they fought effectively, with tools that matched the threat they faced. Technical Sergeant Frank Murphy, an armorer with the 95th Bomb Group, kept informal statistics on tailgun effectiveness before and after the Cheyenne modification. His data, scrawled in a notebook and later donated to the Air Force Historical Research Agency, showed that tailgunners with the new mount reported successful defensive engagements at twice the rate of those with the old Stinger configuration. This wasn't scientific. The sample size was small, limited to Murphy's own bomb group over 3 months. But the pattern was clear. Better visibility, better gun control, better sights equals better survival. The Luftwaffe noticed too, intelligence analysts studying German radio intercepts and debriefing prisoners found references to American bombers with improved rear armament. Some German fighter pilots began avoiding tail approaches entirely on bombers they suspected had the new modification, preferring to attack from other angles where the defensive fire was less concentrated. This was the ultimate validation of Ericsson's design. The enemy was changing tactics to avoid it. By June of 1944, when the Cheyenne tail began appearing on production line B-17s, the modification had already been installed on more than 300 aircraft passing through field modification centers in England. By the end of the war, more than 5,000 B-17s had received the new tail section at some point in their service lives, either at Cheyenne, at other modification centers, at the factories themselves, or at field maintenance facilities in England and Italy. The modification wasn't perfect. It added approximately 115 pounds to the aircraft's weight, mostly in the hydraulic system and the larger windows. This required minor ballast adjustments in some aircraft. The new mount required more maintenance than the simple manual yoke, though it was still straightforward enough for regular armorers to handle, and it couldn't solve every problem. Tail gunners still faced enemy fighters, flak, mechanical failures, and the brutal mathematics of 25 mission tours at a time when loss rates meant most crews wouldn't finish. But it gave them tools that worked. It gave them visibility, control, and the ability to aim accurately at the moment when it mattered most. That was the difference between bureaucratic adequacy and genuine care for the men who had to use the equipment. W. Erickson never became famous. He received no medals, no public recognition. His name doesn't appear in most histories of the B-17 or the bombing campaign over Europe. He continued working at the Cheyenne Modification Center throughout the war, supervising the installation of his own design, along with hundreds of other modifications on thousands of aircraft. When the war ended, he went back to maintaining civilian aircraft for United Airlines, retiring in 1953. He died in 1968 in Cheyenne, Wyoming, 75 years old. His obituary in the local newspaper, describing him as a long-time United Airlines employee and community member, it did not mention that he had designed one of the most significant improvements to American bomber defensive armament in the Second World War. But the men who flew with the Cheyenne tail knew, the gunners who came home because they could see the fighters coming and had time to react, the crews who survived because their tail gunner put effective fire into attackers who had expected an easy approach. They knew. After the war, at reunions of bomb groups and Air Force associations, veterans of the European Air War would sometimes talk about equipment, about what worked and what didn't, about the chin turret that stopped head-on attacks, about the staggered waist guns that gave gunners room to move, about a dozen modifications that had been implemented during the war to fix problems nobody had anticipated in peacetime. And they would talk about the Cheyenne tail, about the day their B-17 came back from modification with those big windows and the pumpkin-shaped mount, about the first time they went into combat with it and realized they could actually see and shoot and defend themselves properly. Some of them would mention W. Erickson by name, having heard the story from armorers or maintenance crews. Most just knew it as the Cheyenne tail, named for the place where someone had cared enough to look at casualty reports and decide that adequate wasn't good enough when lives were at stake. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The statistical legacy of the Cheyenne tail modification tells a story that individual anecdotes can only hint at. Between March and December of 1944, as the modification spread through the 8th Air Force, casualty rates for tail gunners showed a measurable decline. This happened even as German fighter tactics became more desperate and aggressive in the face of impending Allied victory. The correlation wasn't perfect. Many factors affected casualty rates, from improved fighter escort to declining Luftwaffe pilot quality to simple luck, but the pattern was consistent enough that post-war analysts at the Air Force Historical Research Agency concluded the Cheyenne tail had contributed to improved survival rates for tailgunner crews. The most telling statistic came from comparing aircraft with the modification to those still awaiting retrofit. In the 95th Bomb Group's records, carefully maintained by armourer Frank Murphy, tailgunners using the Cheyenne mount reported successful defensive engagements, defined as forcing an attacking fighter to break off without delivering effective fire, in 47% of encounters. Tailgunners still using the old Stinger mount reported successful defensive engagements in 23% of encounters, nearly double the effectiveness. That translated directly into survival. Aircraft with tailgunners who could defend effectively survived more missions. Crews who survived more missions gained experience. Experience meant better decision-making, better formation flying, better survival in the brutal mathematics of the air war. Second Lieutenant Robert Chen, a tailgunner with the 401st Bomb Group, completed his 25-mission tour in October of 1944. 23 of those missions were flown in aircraft equipped with the Cheyenne tail. In his oral history interview, recorded in 1992 by the Veterans History Project, Chen described what the modification had meant to him. "I was terrified every mission," he said, "and anyone who says they weren't terrified is either lying or crazy. But with the new tail setup, I felt like I had a chance. I could see the fighters forming up. I could track them as they came in. The guns went where I aimed them. The sight worked. It sounds simple, but when you're 20,000 feet over Germany and someone's trying to kill you, simple things that work make all the difference. I came home because someone designed equipment that gave me a fighting chance." That phrase, "a fighting chance," appears again and again in veteran testimony about the Cheyenne tail. Not a guarantee, not invulnerability, just a chance to use skill and training effectively, to fight back with tools that matched the threat. That was all W. Erickson had promised. That was what he delivered. The success of the Cheyenne tail modification had ripple effects beyond just the B-17 program. It demonstrated that field modifications, developed by experienced maintenance personnel close to the problem, could sometimes surpass officially sanctioned designs created by large engineering teams far from combat. This lesson influenced how the Army Air Forces approached equipment development for the rest of the war. When the B-29 Superfortress began operations in the Pacific, its tailgun position incorporated design elements directly inspired by the Cheyenne tail. Large windows, powered mount, advanced sighting system. The B-29's designers had seen the B-17 modification data and understood what worked. They designed accordingly. Post-war aircraft like the B-36 and B-52 continued this evolution, with increasingly sophisticated tail defense systems that all traced their conceptual lineage back to a civilian engineer in Wyoming who had looked at casualty reports and decided to do something about them. The modification also changed how the military approached contractor relationships. United Airlines' relatively loose contract, which had given Erickson the freedom to develop unauthorized modifications, became a model for future defense contracts that valued innovation and field experience. The Pentagon realized that good ideas could come from anywhere, not just from official channels, and that speed of implementation sometimes mattered more than perfect bureaucratic procedure. Not everyone at the time appreciated these lessons. There were officers at Wright Field who resented that a civilian contractor had identified and solved a problem that should have been caught by military engineers. There were procurement officials who worried that unauthorized modifications set dangerous precedents. There were even a few combat veterans who preferred the old Stinger tail. claiming it was lighter and less complicated, though these voices were distinctly in the minority. But results have a way of silencing critics. The Cheyenne tail worked. It saved lives. It improved combat effectiveness. Those facts were undeniable, and they overwhelmed objections about proper procedure and channels of authority. By late 1944, the modification was so widely accepted that few people even remembered it had been controversial. It was just how B-17s were built, the standard, the way it should have been from the beginning. The human cost of not having the modification earlier is impossible to calculate precisely. How many tail gunners died in 1942 and 1943, not because they lacked courage or skill, but because they lacked adequate visibility, gun control, and sighting systems. How many B-17s were lost because tail gunners couldn't defend effectively against rear quarter attacks? The numbers would be speculative, but every B-17 lost meant 10 men, some dead, some wounded, some prisoners of war. For the duration, the mathematics of what-if scenarios are always uncertain. What is certain is that from March 1944 forward, tail gunners had better equipment. That equipment saved some lives. How many? Enough to matter. Enough that post-war veterans' reunions featured groups of men who knew they had come home because someone in Cheyenne had cared enough to read casualty reports and act on what those reports revealed. Staff Sergeant Thomas Brennan, the gunner instructor who had tested the first Cheyenne tail prototype in February of 1944, completed his own combat tour in the summer of that year. He flew 28 missions as a tail gunner with the 303rd Bomb Group, all in aircraft equipped with the modification he had helped evaluate. He was credited with 2 confirmed kills and 4 probable kills against German fighters. He survived his tour without serious injury. After the war, he returned to Cheyenne and worked for United Airlines as a training supervisor until his retirement in 1972. He remained friends with W. Erickson until Erickson's death in 1968. At Erickson's funeral, Brennan gave a short eulogy that barely a dozen people heard. Bill Erickson wasn't a soldier, Brennan said. He never wore a uniform. He never fired a shot in combat. But he saved more American lives than most heroes you'll read about. He looked at a problem everyone else accepted as inevitable, and he fixed it. Not for glory, not for recognition. He did it because it was the right thing to do, and because he had the skill to do it. That's the definition of a hero in my book. I'm alive today because Bill Erickson cared about people he never met. A lot of other men are too. That's his legacy. The United Airlines Modification Center in Cheyenne continued operations until 1946. At its peak, in 1944, it employed more than 1,600 workers and modified nearly 5,000 B-17s. The facility developed numerous innovations beyond the Cheyenne tail. The monocoque cheek guns, designed by Erickson, gave B-17s better frontal defense, improved radio installations, increased reliability, modified electrical systems, reduced fire hazards. But the tail modification remained the center's most significant contribution to the war effort. After the war ended, the facility was returned to civilian aviation use. United Airlines maintained it as a maintenance base until 1961, when advancing aviation technology and geographic limitations made it obsolete. The buildings were eventually torn down. Today, Cheyenne Regional Airport occupies part of the site. A historical marker near the terminal briefly mentions that during World War II, United Airlines modified thousands of B-17 bombers at this location. It doesn't mention W. Erickson. It doesn't mention the Cheyenne tail. It doesn't tell the story of how a civilian engineer saved lives by refusing to accept that adequate was good enough. The B-17 Flying Fortress itself entered military service history as one of the most successful bombers of World War II. Its crews dropped hundreds of thousands of tons of bombs on Nazi Germany. Its missions helped destroy German war production, disrupt transportation, and contribute to Allied victory. The aircraft's ruggedness and defensive armament became legendary. Images of damaged B-17s limping home became iconic symbols of American determination and engineering excellence. But that defensive armament wasn't always excellent. It was improved repeatedly by men who looked at combat results and made changes. The chin turret that stopped head-on attacks, the staggered waist guns that gave gunners room to work, the better turrets, better sights, better everything that emerged from the painful process of learning what worked and what didn't. The Cheyenne tail was part of that evolution, perhaps the most important part, given how many men sat in that position, alone in the rear of the aircraft, facing the threat that every bomber crew knew was most likely to kill them. By the end of World War II, 12,677 B-17s had been built. Of these, more than 8,000 saw combat service. More than 4,700 were lost in combat operations, with another 900 damaged beyond repair. The men who flew those aircraft, more than 125,000 aircrew members across all positions, suffered a casualty rate of nearly 47% killed or wounded. These numbers represent the cost of the daylight strategic bombing campaign against Nazi Germany, a campaign prosecuted with courage, determination, and ultimately success, but at a terrible price in young lives. The Cheyenne tail modification didn't change those fundamental numbers. It couldn't make the bombing campaign safe or easy or anything other than brutally dangerous. But it did mean that some percentage of those men came home who might not have otherwise. It meant that tail gunners could do their jobs with tools that worked. It meant that when German fighters attacked from behind, American gunners had visibility, control, and effective sighting that gave them a genuine chance to defend. That was W. Ericsson's contribution to the war, not a miracle weapon, not a silver bullet, just better equipment for men doing an impossible job. In February of 2003, the commemorative Air Force completed restoration of a B-17G named Sentimental Journey. The aircraft, built in 1944, featured a Cheyenne tail as part of its original production equipment. The restoration team, working from original documentation and surviving examples, painstakingly recreated every detail of the tail section. The large windows, the pumpkin-shaped mount, the reflector sight, the hydraulic controls. When the restoration was complete, one of the volunteers, a former Air Force armorer who had maintained B-52s during the Cold War, spent time examining the tail section. He had never seen a B-17 up close before, only studied them in books and technical manuals. "It's elegant," he said, running his hand along the gun mount's frame. "Simple but effective. Whoever designed this understood what gunners needed. You can see the thinking that went into it. This isn't just engineering. This is caring about the guy who has to sit back here and use this equipment. That kind of design doesn't happen by accident." He was right. It didn't happen by accident. It happened because W. Erickson, a 51-year-old civilian engineer in Wyoming, read casualty reports and couldn't accept that young men were dying with inadequate equipment. It happened because he had the skill to design something better, the courage to build it without official approval, and the persistence to see it through bureaucratic resistance to implementation. It happened because sometimes the solution to a problem doesn't come from the people who are supposed to solve it, but from someone who cares enough to try. Today, surviving B-17s sit in museums across America. The planes at the National Museum of the United States Air Force, at the Museum of Flight in Seattle, at the mighty 8th Air Force Museum in Georgia, and dozens of other institutions. Most of them feature Cheyenne tails. The modification became so standard, so integral to the B-17 design, that it's invisible to most visitors. They see a flying fortress. They see the famous profile, the distinctive tail, the gun position that defended countless aircraft over hostile territory. They don't see the story behind that design, the story of failure, recognized and corrected, the story of a system that wasn't good enough, and the men who fixed it. They don't see W. Erickson working through the night in a cold hangar in Wyoming, designing a mount that would give gunners a fighting chance. They don't see James Hannigan writing letters home before his final mission, describing equipment that didn't work well enough to save his life. They don't see Thomas Brennan testing the first prototype and recognizing immediately that this was what should have existed from the beginning. They don't see Richard Manning tracking German fighters through the new large windows, getting his guns on target 3 seconds earlier than would have been possible with the old system. 3 seconds that meant the difference between a kill and being killed. They see a tailgun position, just another component of a complex aircraft, but that component has a history written in engineering drawings, casualty reports, after-action assessments, and the survival of men who came home because their equipment worked when it mattered most. The Cheyenne tail modification stands as a lesson in several principles that remained relevant long after World War II ended. First, that equipment design must be driven by operational reality, not theoretical requirements. The Stinger tail looked adequate on paper and in tests. In combat, against experienced enemy pilots exploiting every weakness, it failed. Only by examining actual combat results could designers understand what needed to change. Second, that the people closest to a problem often understand it better than distant experts. W. Erickson wasn't a combat veteran. He hadn't flown missions over Germany, but he read the casualty reports, talked to pilots and gunners, understood the tactical situation, and synthesized that information into effective engineering. Sometimes expertise comes from careful attention to evidence rather than from personal experience. Third, that speed of implementation matters. The Cheyenne tail went from concept to combat in less than 2 months. Traditional military procurement would have taken years. Men died during those years. The Army Air Force's willingness to fast-track an unauthorized contractor modification saved lives by getting better equipment to combat units immediately. Fourth, that adequate is not good enough when lives are at stake. The Stinger tail was adequate by pre-war standards. It provided defensive fire. It met minimum requirements. But minimum requirements kill people when the enemy is competent and aggressive. Excellence in equipment design isn't optional. It's a moral obligation to the men who depend on that equipment. And finally, that recognition matters less than results. W. Erickson died largely unknown. His name doesn't appear in most histories. He received no medals, no public honors, no fame, but he saved lives. That was the result. That was what mattered. That was enough. The story of the Cheyenne tail is ultimately a story about caring. Not abstract caring, not sentimental caring, but practical caring, expressed through skilled action. W. Erickson could have done his assigned job, installed the standard equipment, sent the aircraft to war with the tail positions as designed. Nobody would have blamed him. The inadequacy of the Stinger tail wasn't his fault. He wasn't responsible for design decisions made years earlier by military engineers. But he read the casualty reports. He understood what they meant. He cared enough to do something about it. That caring, combined with engineering skill and organizational courage, produced a modification that made a real difference in a war where small improvements sometimes meant the difference between survival and death. Every B-17 that flew missions with a Cheyenne tail carried that caring into combat. Every tail gunner who benefited from better visibility, better gun control, better sights, was the recipient of W. Erickson's refusal to accept that adequate was good enough. They didn't know his name. Most of them never knew the story of how the modification came to exist, but they used his design. They survived because of it. Some of them. Not all. Never all. The war was too brutal for any modification to save everyone. But some. That was the gift. A fighting chance when it mattered most. Better tools for an impossible job. The knowledge that someone, somewhere, had looked at the problem and cared enough to fix it properly. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.